Last week, I wrote about temptation, which takes place in the alienated mind. I stated this was inevitable as a way to understand the Christian heritage of us being all sinners. I stated it could not happen. We are bound to get tempted and succumb to temptation until we find salvation in God's eternity. I don't want this to be misunderstood or used as an excuse for sin. We are not bound to make again and again the very same mistakes. We might be bound to commit sin again and again, which is just another way to say we might be bound to always be fallible on our own and make all kinds of mistakes, but that doesn't mean we can't put an end to vicious circles one by one and grow further in the presence of God. We are still responsible for what's happening to us. We are responsible to make sure it is eventually happening for us as it is meant to be. We make it happen. There is no fatality in said addiction, said unhelpful pattern. It is up to us to decide what we are doing in the face of temptation and our past mistakes, shortcomings, and limitations. But there is not a thing we can do without the help of God. In this video, I will talk about one way I got tempted within this life and the pattern I'm now able to analyze that made me grow out of it. A smoking hell. I quit smoking. At some point I was smoking 2 rolled cigarettes in each 5-minute break between 2 classes. I would smoke up to 30 cigarettes a day and maybe more when I would go to parties and hangouts. For the most part of the 5 or 6 years where I was a heavy smoker, I wanted to quit. I would go down to 20, 15, 10 or even 5 cigarettes a day. It would last 2 days, maybe up to 3 weeks sometimes. I would manage to achieve a 24 or perhaps a 48-hour heroic non-smoking explode. And then I just couldn't take it any longer and would dive right back into it head first. The short explanation was that it was all from a mental space that I wanted to quit. Out of rationalization, not from the heart, or rather not from the heart harnessed by the spirit, and rather harnessed by the alienation of my own mind. While I was wanting to quit mentally, my heart actually didn't want to quit at all. It didn't want to address the temptation it had fallen into in some kind of a guilt trip. I didn't want to address that it felt so good to smoke cigarettes. I didn't want to own that I was a sinner. It felt so good as a way to make up for the wrong it caused for my health and relationship to authority, either parental, my relationship to societal expectations, and common sense. That's temptation. That's something worth repenting for, which for years I wasn't willing to. I just artificially wanted to be healthy, meet external expectations, and I desperately tried to keep up with my own standards of being a man that could wield power over himself, first and foremost, but without having to do the spiritual work required in order to do that. Without taking responsibility, I was stuck in victim mentality. So what changed? What happened that created the shift? What made me worthy of being handed the proper tools to grow out of temptation and into salvation? There is a combination of multiple factors. First of all, I have to admit something to myself and all dubious, skeptical or agnostic people, and especially those reluctant to the idea that we all sin and that's always why we're in trouble, regardless of how empathetic we can get to the reasons why people sin. I managed to quit after what I would call a second spiritual wave in my life. Religion, spirituality, and metaphysics would constantly be disregarded in my school system, family, and overall surroundings. When it came to spirituality, it would only be seen as an interesting historical object of a less advanced humanity. When it came to religion, it would only be seen as a terrible, greedy, and hateful institution with so much blood on their hands we couldn't possibly see anything good within it. And when it came to metaphysics, it was just abstract, boring, useless subjects of conversation. Despite all of that, something always pulled me towards these things, and so I constantly had some sort of love-hate relationship with them. However, I knew I was pursuing truth. I might have sometimes been incredibly stubborn to admit parts of it, but I always had this inclination within me that I was better off with some harsh truth rather than an army of sweet lies. And so, after a first spiritual wave in my early teens that were more about reading about Buddhism and all kinds of mythologies and theologies, all but the Christian dreadful one, right? The second wave was more about New Age spirituality, Western esotericism, astrology and alchemy, Jungian psychology, and Christian mysticism. Long story short, this led me to cultivate spiritual thoughts, to ponder on metaphysical objects like eternity, unconditional love, universal or cosmic consciousness, judgment and grace, and to at least partially reconcile myself with the idea of sin. And I started to pray. I started to pray the Our Father prayer and the Hail Mary prayers, which brought up a dimension in my spiritual life that was not present when it used to be all about meditating and emptying the mind. And it led me to look up at Christ, read the Bible, to start to comprehend the importance, wisdom, and benevolence of some of the messages it held, regardless of any metaphysical belief system one might decide or not to hold. I never prayed about quitting smoking. I'm just saying I didn't manage to quit what was one of my greatest addictions until after a deeper integration of spiritual ideas and practices such as prayer into my life. But what happened eventually that actually finished to rewire my heart towards spirit when it comes to smoke and cigarettes, instead of it being harnessed by the alienation of my own mind, is that I met the angel of death. After I started to make my mind point in the right direction through prayer, I was being reflected with how much some of my behaviors had been drifting away from the right direction. It cannot not happen. It is intrinsical to the nature of reality according to God's law. This negative reflection of our sinful nature is what I called the angel of death. I believe it is one of the core manifestations of God, or one of the angels that is the closest to the heart of God, as counterintuitive as it might sound, whose relationship is Christianity is depicted before anything else in the crucifixion. It is the negation of God, which paired with His love is what creates upward movement into our souls, away from death and into spiritual life. If I want to use a more earthly language, to keep it as basic and simple as possible, what I mean is, in order to pursue the good and experience it more and more into your life, you both need to identify and see the goodness of the good. So you need to proactively desire the good. And also, you need to identify and feel the badness of the bad. So you need to proactively repel the bad away from you while desiring the good. And so the ultimate incarnation of the good is God, by definition. While the ultimate incarnation of the bad is who I call the angel of death, which is God's negative principle that propels you towards him. And it is not to be confounded with the devil, but that's for another video. So one day, as I was hanging out at my friend's apartment, her neighbor showed up for whatever reason. She was fit, tanned, had red hair, and dark makeup under her eyes. She just came back from some sort of extreme sports 3-day event. As she was praised by my two female friends for being in such great shape, she proceeded to explain how seeing her dad die from cigarette addiction completely broke her heart and was a traumatic thing to witness because of how bad it looked and in how much pain he was, etc., etc., etc. And she just went on and on and on with all this suffering, her own and her father's suffering. And there was something special, something different than virtue signaling or the usual warnings about health. In the way she was talking about it and describing it, there was something real. I could feel her pain and through her father's nightmare before he died of cigarettes. She was my angel of death when it comes to cigarettes. Something clicked at this moment. I realized how stupid it was, how disrespectful to the body God offered me, and how neglectful it was to the people who cared about me. It was not about me anymore, not about performance, not about ego, not about being man enough and stopping cigarettes. It was something more, something greater that I needed to honor through stopping. And this all happened because I met this so-called angel of death. My heart showed up again and I knew I was done. I could see both the good of ending this addiction and feel the bad of going on with it. And so I was ready. Aide-toi, le ciel t'aidera. It's the French equivalent for God helps those who help themselves. Once I met the angel of death, I was ready to quit and I couldn't find in me to keep second guessing myself. Even though I didn't have any more tangible tool to make it happen, I just couldn't not make it happen. I started to proactively seek solutions. And after a few minutes of frenzy, my mind got quiet and seemingly out of nowhere, these words came out of my mouth. Aide-toi, le ciel t'aidera. God helps those who help themselves. The first thing that came to mind was to write myself something encouraging. To help myself with words, which is something I didn't really do before. That might have been one of the first times I've ever did that. The next thing was to buy nicotine patches, which I never did before, where I always tried to brute force it. So it was all coming up with ideas, having no idea what I was doing, but knowing I was actually doing it, helping myself and leaving the rest to God. The nicotine patches, I eventually barely used them, but the psychological action of making this extra step in that mindset of helping myself to the extent I could, if I wanted to get extra help, this did the work. Prayer led me to meet the angel of death in a way I could get to the other side of it okay. And I was left with the urge to do whatever it takes to help myself, no matter what, and leave the rest in the hands of God. And this did the work. The power of brotherhood. I did this on my own. Nobody told me how to quit smoking. I was surrounded by heavy smokers and people finding that cool. And while being on my own, I wasn't on my own. In prayer, I had reached out to spiritual forces that go far beyond any kind of human comprehension. All we can do is to testify of its reality as it manifests into our life. And it manifests into our life as long as we're ready to take a leap of faith towards these forces. I was blessed in that way in my life that when I found myself in a corner where I felt like I was all alone, truth was that I wasn't. I was guided, I was helped, I was willing to serve this calming presence, this calming light, this calming love. I was ready to surrender to them. However, the more I did that, the more I realized I was not supposed to be on my own and actually wasn't. I never was really on my own even when I believed I was. I was just one asking for help away from having the support and accountability of any man I know. And it is still something I have a tough time to learn. Getting a core membership has been incredibly helpful once I got out of the lonely hole I dug for myself for so long in order to strengthen my foundation, to come up with a vision that makes sense for your life, determine the one thing to focus on to move forward, and hold each other accountable with male peers is hard. But it's worth it. If you need to figure out your one thing and be held accountable by other trusted men, sign up for the next Genesis workshop held by Paul Lloyd Robson or one of his coaches now. The link is in the description below. Take care.